The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as the FBI director finished up his meetings for the day. The office had been buzzing with reports, updates, and discussions that were critical to the national security of the country. But now, as he wrapped up the final briefing, there was a moment of calm. It was late afternoon, and he felt a sense of relief knowing he could finally head home after a long day of demanding decisions. The drive back to his apartment wasn't long, just a few miles through the city. He appreciated the quiet moments behind the wheel, where he could unwind even if just for a short while. It was a rare chance to be out of the chaos and in his own space, even if it meant navigating through traffic. The streets were crowded at this hour, with cars moving steadily, their headlights starting to flicker on as dusk settled in. He rolled the windows down slightly, letting in the cool breeze that hinted at the evening to come. The sounds of the city, the hum of traffic, and the occasional honking of horns felt strangely peaceful. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax, enjoying the feeling of being just another person on the road. But that peace was suddenly shattered. The familiar sound of a siren echoed from behind him, piercing through the calm of the evening. His heart skipped a beat. He glanced at his rearview mirror, instinctively noting the flashing lights. It wasn't a surprise to be pulled over. His position meant he was often stopped by law enforcement when traveling for work. But this time, something about it felt off. The officer behind him was driving a police cruiser, its lights flashing brightly in the darkness, demanding immediate attention. The director glanced around, trying to find a reason for the stop. Was he speeding? No, he had been keeping a steady pace. The light ahead was green, and there hadn't been anything unusual in his driving. With a sigh, he eased his car to the side of the road, just as he had done countless times before during similar situations. As the car came to a halt, he turned off the engine and reached for his ID wallet, preparing for the routine interaction. He wasn't concerned. He had been stopped by police numerous times throughout his career, and had always handled the situation with calm professionalism. A quick exchange of information, a polite apology, and he'd be on his way again. The officer stepped out of his car and approached the director's vehicle with a sense of urgency. The director observed the officer closely, noting the young man's sharp movements and rigid posture. There was something different in the air, a nervous tension that the director immediately picked up on. Most officers, in his experience, were more at ease during such encounters, even when pulling over someone important. But this officer was acting as if he had just been thrust into a much larger situation. The director rolled down his window slowly, keeping his hands in clear view. "Good evening, officer," he said, his tone calm but courteous. He knew how important it was to set the right tone from the start. The officer didn't respond immediately. He seemed to hesitate, his gaze flickering between the director and his car. The director could see that the officer was unsure about something. Was this a simple mistake? Maybe the officer had just gotten distracted or confused by the traffic. The director had seen that happen before, especially in busy areas like this. "License and registration," the officer finally said, his voice tense. The director, slightly puzzled by the officer's behavior, nodded and began to reach for his registration. But before he could retrieve it, the officer's next words caught him completely off guard. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer commanded, his tone firm but strained. The director blinked in surprise. That wasn't normal, at least not for a routine traffic stop. He had been pulled over countless times before, and he had never once been asked to exit the vehicle. His initial instinct was to ask what was going on, to explain who he was. But there was something about the officer's demeanor that made him pause. Something wasn't right. "Officer," the director began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm the director of the FBI. If this is a misunderstanding, I'd be happy to clear it up right now." But before he could finish his sentence, the officer raised his hand to his holster, his fingers hovering over the grip of his gun. The director froze. He had been trained to handle tense situations, to stay calm under pressure, but this was a new level of discomfort. Why was the officer reacting this way? "Step out of the vehicle. Now," the officer repeated, his voice shaking slightly, but his grip on the gun tightening. The director's mind raced. He had been in high-stress situations before, some that involved guns, some that involved dangerous criminals, but this felt different. The officer, young and visibly nervous, was pointing his weapon directly at him. This was no longer a simple traffic stop. It had escalated quickly, and he had no idea why. The director took a deep breath and slowly opened the door, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. He didn't want to make any sudden gestures that might escalate the situation further. His thoughts were a blur, a mix of disbelief and confusion. Was this really happening? He had expected some kind of mistake or confusion, but this felt far more serious than that. The moment he stepped out of the car, the officer barked another order. "Turn around. Hands on your head." His heart pounded in his chest as he complied. He felt the cold steel of the handcuffs snap around his wrists. The young officer, still holding his gun, kept his distance but watched every move the director made with intense focus. For a moment, the director wondered if this was a terrible misunderstanding. He had dealt with law enforcement for decades, and he understood the power of being in the public eye, the risks that came with being a high-ranking government official. But this was something else. As the officer stood there, tense and still holding the gun, the director's mind was spinning. What had gone wrong? Why had this young officer treated him this way? He had to remind himself that police officers weren't perfect, that they too were human and could make mistakes. But still, there was something unsettling about the situation. He had no idea what was going to happen next, and then it hit him. The officer didn't know who he was. He didn't recognize the director of the FBI. To this officer, the man standing in front of him was just another driver, a man who had done something wrong. In that moment, the director felt completely powerless. It wasn't just about being mistaken for someone else, it was about being treated like a criminal in front of a stranger who had no idea of his true identity. The moment the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the director's world narrowed down. Everything around him felt like a blur. His heart raced, and for the first time in a long while he felt a pang of vulnerability. Standing in the middle of a quiet street with a gun aimed at him, the man who was used to controlling high-stakes situations felt completely powerless. He glanced at the officer. The young man was still trembling slightly, his grip on the weapon tight. The director didn't know what to make of the situation. Was it a mistake? Or was the officer simply scared, overreacting to something he didn't understand? His mind raced with thoughts of how this could have escalated so quickly. He had dealt with countless high-pressure situations, but this felt like something entirely different. The officer, his face pale, barked another order, this time directing him to kneel on the ground. The director complied, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. His thoughts were still spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Why are you doing this?" The words left his mouth almost without thinking. He had hoped for some kind of explanation, but the officer just stared at him, eyes wide with uncertainty. "I said don't move," the officer replied, his voice shaky but firm. The director understood. The officer wasn't in control of the situation either. He was just as scared as the director, maybe even more so. He had no idea who he was dealing with. No idea that the man kneeling before him held one of the highest positions in the country's security. The director's position as head of the FBI, with years of experience managing crises, had never felt so irrelevant. Time seemed to slow down as the director knelt on the cold asphalt, his hands still locked in the handcuffs behind him. He could hear the distant hum of traffic, but it seemed so far away, as if the world had closed in around them. It was strange. The normally bustling street felt eerily silent. He wondered if anyone had noticed what was happening. Could someone come to his aid? Would someone recognize him? But in that moment, nothing happened. The world continued to move, but he was stuck in this bizarre situation. He had no idea how to fix it. The officer, still standing with his gun drawn, didn't seem to know either. There was an awkward silence between them. The director felt the tension in the air. He could see the officer's hand trembling slightly, his eyes darting nervously around. Was he second-guessing his actions now? For a moment, the director thought about making a move. Maybe if he reached for his ID or his phone, he could explain everything, clear up the misunderstanding. But then he thought better of it. Any sudden movement could make things worse. If the officer was already this tense, making him feel threatened in any way could have disastrous consequences. Instead, he tried to calm himself. He needed to keep his composure, to stay collected. His years of experience had taught him the importance of remaining calm in the most unpredictable situations. But this wasn't just a matter of professional training, it was personal now. His life was in someone else's hands. He couldn't afford to let fear dictate his actions. Seconds stretched into minutes. The director's mind raced, trying to figure out the best course of action. Should he try to talk to the officer again? Should he explain who he was once more? Or should he wait for someone else to show up and intervene? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of approaching sirens broke the silence. The director's heart skipped a beat. Were they coming to help him? Or was something else about to go wrong? His mind couldn't stop running through the possibilities. The officer's demeanor didn't seem to change. He was still tense, still holding his weapon, his focus entirely on the director. The sirens grew louder, and then a police car pulled up next to them. A senior officer, a man in his 50s, stepped out of the car. He surveyed the situation quickly, his eyes flicking between the young officer and the director. There was a brief moment of tension, a silent exchange of glances between the two officers. "What's going on here?" the senior officer asked, his voice stern but calm. The young officer, still standing rigidly, replied in a shaky voice, He's refusing to cooperate." He paused, clearly unsure of how to explain the situation. His voice trailed off. The senior officer looked at the director, his gaze softening as he took in the man's demeanor. The director met his gaze, trying to communicate with his eyes the sheer confusion and disbelief of the situation. "Is there a problem, sir?" the senior officer asked gently. The director took a deep breath. "I'm the director of the FBI," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. He wasn't sure if the officer would believe him, but it was worth a try. The senior officer's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He glanced quickly at the young officer, whose eyes widened in shock. "Wait, you're—" the young officer started to say, but the senior officer cut him off. "Is that true?" he asked the director, his tone more serious now. The director nodded. "Yes, I've been with the FBI for years. I'm the director." The senior officer turned to the younger officer, his expression one of disbelief. "You pulled over the director of the FBI? With a weapon drawn?" His voice was a mix of frustration and concern. The young officer stammered, trying to explain himself. I didn't know. He wasn't cooperating, and I thought—" The senior officer shook his head, his face hardening. "You don't pull a weapon unless there's a clear and present threat. You don't treat people like that, especially not someone of his position." The director, still kneeling on the ground, felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things were going to be cleared up. Maybe this nightmare was finally going to end. But the senior officer's gaze remained fixed on the young officer, and the director realized that things were far from over. The younger officer's mistake had just become a serious issue. The senior officer moved toward the young man and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. He spoke quietly, but the words carried weight. "You're going to have to answer for this," he said, his voice low but firm. The young officer swallowed hard, his face turning red with embarrassment. It was clear he knew the gravity of his mistake. He had gone too far, far beyond what was necessary in the situation. As the senior officer spoke to the young man, the director remained silent, still kneeling on the ground. He felt the weight of the situation, but he also felt the tension beginning to ease. The officer's gun was no longer aimed at him, and the handcuffs had loosened, though they hadn't yet been removed. The senior officer was making it clear that this was a mistake, a serious one, and one that needed to be addressed. And just as quickly as it had begun, the situation was beginning to shift, but the director knew that things weren't over yet. The consequences of the young officer's actions would be far-reaching, and the fallout would likely affect both of their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Part 2 builds on the initial tension, exploring the director's inner thoughts and feelings as the situation unfolds and the mistake is realized. It keeps the audience engaged by offering insight into both the director's emotions and the officer's mistakes. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments or further development. As the senior officer continued to speak with the young officer, the director remained kneeling on the cold pavement, his hands still bound by the handcuffs. The air around him felt thick with tension. The situation had shifted in his favor, but he couldn't shake the feeling that everything wasn't over yet. There was still a long road ahead, and though he had been recognized, there were still questions that needed answers. The young officer stood there, his face red with embarrassment, his hands trembling slightly.
He had made a grave mistake.
The director could see that much. The senior officer had already begun speaking to him sternly, but it was clear that the younger man was struggling to process what he had done. "What were you thinking?" the senior officer asked, his voice firm but with a hint of concern. The younger officer didn't respond at first. His eyes were on the ground as though he couldn't bear to meet the gaze of his superior or the director. The director took a deep breath. His mind was still spinning from the shock of the situation. He had never imagined something like this would happen to him. His position had always kept him in high-stress, high-stakes environments, but nothing compared to being pulled over by a police officer, held at gunpoint, and treated like a criminal. He had expected the officer to make an apology to clear things up immediately, but instead he felt the weight of the situation deepen as the officer continued to stumble through his explanation. The senior officer, a man who clearly had more experience, looked at the young officer with a mix of frustration and disappointment. "We'll deal with this," the senior officer said after a long pause. "You need to go back to the precinct. This isn't something you can just walk away from." The young officer nodded, his face pale. The director could see that he was on the verge of breaking down, the weight of his actions catching up with him. It was clear that the mistake he had made would haunt him for a long time. For a moment, the director almost felt sorry for him. He knew what it was like to make a mistake in the line of duty. But this was different. This mistake could have had serious consequences, not just for the officer, but for everyone involved. After a few more exchanges, the senior officer turned to the director. His face softened, and there was an understanding in his eyes that the situation had been nothing short of disastrous. "I'm sorry for what happened here, sir," the senior officer said. "This shouldn't have occurred. We'll make sure to sort this out." The director nodded, trying to remain composed. He wasn't one for public displays of emotion, but inside a flood of feelings swirled. Anger, frustration, and confusion mixed with a deep sense of disbelief. How had things gotten so out of hand? How had a simple traffic stop escalated to this point? "I appreciate that," the director said, his voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. There are systems in place to prevent this kind of thing from happening. And this isn't just a mistake. This is something that needs to be addressed, not just for me, but for anyone who could find themselves in a similar situation." The senior officer nodded again. He clearly understood the gravity of what had happened. The director's words were not just about his own experience, but about a larger issue, a breakdown in communication, training, or perhaps a lapse in judgment on a larger scale. There had to be a reason why an officer would act this way, and it wasn't just about a mistake. There was a deeper issue at play. The officer who had initially pulled the director over was now standing a few paces away, his hands still shaking. He didn't meet the director's eyes. He was too ashamed, too caught up in his own guilt to make eye contact. The director noticed this. He could tell the officer felt the weight of his actions. "Look, I don't know what made you act the way you did," the director said, his tone softer now. "But there are ways to handle these things. It's not about being scared or overreacting. It's about protocol, about using your training to assess the situation. I know it's not always easy, but this could have gone so much worse than it did." The young officer nodded, his eyes still on the ground. It was clear that he didn't have the words to express his regret, but the director could see that the guilt was eating him up inside. "Maybe next time," the director continued, "you'll think twice before pulling a weapon so quickly. There are other ways to handle situations. We all make mistakes, but it's what we do after that matters." The senior officer gave the young officer a look that spoke volumes. He was clearly disappointed in him, but he also knew that this was a teachable moment. There was a lesson here, not just for the young officer, but for everyone involved. The director's words seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment, the scene felt like it was frozen in time. The officers stood there in silence, each processing what had just happened. The director was still kneeling on the ground, his hands cuffed, but his mind was elsewhere. He had been through so many tense situations before, many involving far greater risks and dangers, but this was different. This was personal. This was about how one moment of fear and poor judgment could have changed everything. As the senior officer turned to handle the paperwork and figure out the next steps, the young officer stood there, still unsure of what to do. He had made his mistake, and now he had to face the consequences. The director, on the other hand, sat quietly, waiting for the situation to be resolved. In that silence, the director couldn't help but think about the bigger picture. What did this incident say about the state of law enforcement? What kind of training and communication gaps existed that could lead to such a misunderstanding? Was it a result of the officer's nerves, or was it a larger systemic issue that needed to be addressed? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. The senior officer was returning, his expression serious. "We've spoken to the higher-ups," he said, his voice calm. "The young officer is going to be suspended while we investigate further. We'll make sure this is handled properly." The director didn't respond immediately. He was still processing everything that had happened. It was a relief to know that the situation would be investigated, but part of him still couldn't quite believe what he had just experienced. He had been pulled over for a routine stop, only to find himself in a potentially life-threatening situation because of one officer's poor judgment. "I'm sorry for the trouble this has caused," the senior officer continued. "We'll make sure something like this doesn't happen again." The director nodded. "I appreciate that. But there's a bigger issue here than just this one officer. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else. It's about accountability." The senior officer nodded in agreement. "We're working on that." With that, the director was finally uncuffed and allowed to get back into his car. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, though it was tinged with a sense of unease. The situation had been resolved, but the impact of it would linger long after. As he drove away, his thoughts were still on the young officer. He had made a mistake, yes, but everyone had their breaking points, their moments of fear or confusion. The director had spent his life making high-pressure decisions, but he understood what it was like to feel out of control. That officer standing there with the gun in his hand had been scared, and it had cost him everything. The director didn't know what the future held for that young officer, but he hoped it would serve as a lesson, not just for him, but for everyone in law enforcement. In the end, it was about more than just enforcing the law. It was about protecting each other, about being responsible, and about doing better even in the most difficult of circumstances. The drive back home felt longer than usual. The director's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as his mind replayed the events of the day over and over again. The weight of the situation hadn't fully settled yet. Despite the senior officer's assurances, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been deeply wrong with the entire interaction. It wasn't just about the young officer's mistake. It was about a breakdown in the system, a moment when everything could have gone terribly wrong. The car moved steadily down the quiet street, but the director's thoughts were far from calm. His job at the FBI had always required him to think critically, to make decisions in moments of extreme pressure. But this had been different. This was personal. The man who had spent his career analyzing risks, ensuring safety, and overseeing complex operations had now found himself on the other side of the law, held at gunpoint, treated as a threat by someone who had no idea who he was. The realization stung. No matter how high-ranking his position was, how many cases he had solved, or how many lives he had helped protect, in that moment, he had been just another person on the side of the road. It didn't matter that he held one of the most powerful positions in the country. To that officer, he was simply a driver, a potential threat. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He quickly glanced at the screen. It was a message from his assistant, checking in on him after the incident. He had expected as much. People in his line of work were always concerned, always checking in. But it wasn't just the staff or colleagues who were worried. It was the system, the very foundation of law enforcement that had been shaken by the officer's actions. He had witnessed firsthand how easily things could spiral out of control. It wasn't just about a single officer's mistake. It was about how fragile the system could be, how quickly a moment of fear could turn into a disaster. He sent a quick reply to his assistant, letting them know he was fine, that the situation had been handled, but he was still processing it all. He didn't know how else to explain it. How could he put into words the sense of vulnerability he had felt? The fear of being at the mercy of someone who had no idea who he was. His thoughts drifted back to the young officer. He had seen the fear in his eyes, the hesitation in his movements. It was clear that the officer hadn't intended for things to escalate the way they had. But what was it that had made him act that way? Was it the pressure of the job? The nervousness of a young officer on his first solo patrol? Or was it something deeper? A lack of proper training or understanding of how to handle high-pressure situations? The director had seen fear many times before in his line of work. It was a natural response in a dangerous or unknown situation, but this was different. This officer wasn't just scared. He was acting on instinct, responding without thinking. And that, the director realized, was what scared him the most. If fear could cause someone to act so recklessly, what else could it lead to? His phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from the senior officer, the one who had intervened when things had gone wrong. The message was brief, just a quick note saying that the investigation into the young officer's actions was already underway, and that the director would be kept updated. The senior officer had assured him that the young man would face consequences for his actions. But even as the director read the message, he couldn't help but wonder, would it be enough? Would this young officer learn from his mistake? Or was this just a temporary setback in an already chaotic career? The director's thoughts were interrupted as he pulled into his parking spot. He sat there for a moment, staring at the building in front of him, unsure of what to do next. He had arrived home, but his mind was still spinning. This wasn't just a minor incident. It was a wake-up call. It was a reminder that even the best systems could fail, that even the most well-trained officers could make life-altering mistakes in the blink of an eye. He didn't know what the future held for the young officer, but he knew one thing for sure. This incident wasn't just about the officer's career, it was about the public trust. The trust that people put in law enforcement to protect them and uphold the law. If that trust was broken, it would take more than a simple investigation to restore it. Inside his apartment, the director set his keys on the kitchen counter and sat down, rubbing his eyes. He was exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained. It had been a long day, filled with tension, confusion, and uncertainty. He wasn't used to feeling this way. He had been in countless dangerous situations, had made decisions that affected the lives of thousands of people. But this was different. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. He had made it out of the situation unharmed, but others weren't so lucky. What if the officer had acted more quickly? What if the director hadn't been able to keep his cool in the moment? What if someone else had been in his place? Someone without the experience or knowledge to de-escalate the situation? The thought was chilling. It was a reminder of just how fragile the line between safety and danger could be. As he sat there, the weight of the day's events began to settle in. The director realized that the true impact of the incident wasn't just about the young officer or the mistake that had been made. It was about the larger issue of accountability. The young officer would face consequences for his actions, but what about the system that allowed him to act that way in the first place? What about the training, the policies, and the practices that led to this breakdown? If those systems weren't addressed, there was nothing stopping this from happening again. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about the entire institution of law enforcement, the way it worked and the way it was perceived by the public. The director knew that his work wasn't finished. This incident was far from over. He would need to push for reforms to ensure that something like this didn't happen again. But more than that, he needed to focus on the bigger picture, the issue of trust, the importance of communication, and the need for officers to remain calm and thoughtful under pressure. It wasn't enough to just punish the young officer. They needed to ensure that this type of mistake didn't become a pattern, that it didn't escalate into something far worse next time. That night, the director barely slept. His mind raced with thoughts of the officer, the investigation, and the future. He knew that this was just the beginning. The investigation into the young officer's actions would likely take weeks, and there would be plenty of media attention. But more than that, the public needed reassurance that the system was still capable of holding officers accountable. That was the true challenge. The trust of the people had to be restored, and it wasn't going to be easy. The next day, as the director prepared for another round of meetings, he found himself thinking back to the young officer. He had made a mistake, yes, but in many ways, the director saw his own reflection in that officer. He had made mistakes too. Mistakes that had cost him personally and professionally. Everyone made mistakes, and everyone deserved a chance to learn from them. But it wasn't just about the individual. It was about the system as a whole, about ensuring that the people who were meant to protect others were doing their jobs with care, responsibility, and thoughtfulness. The director knew that change wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The events of the day had opened his eyes to the realities of his work in a way he hadn't expected. And now, he had a new mission: to ensure that the lessons learned from this incident would lead to real change, not just for the young officer, but for the entire system. The days that followed felt like a blur. The director found himself caught between the demands of his job and the lingering thoughts about the incident. The phone calls, meetings, and paperwork continued, but his mind often drifted back to the young officer and the mistake that had turned his life upside down. Despite everything that had happened, the director knew that this wasn't just an isolated event. It was part of a much larger conversation. The public's trust in law enforcement had been shaken, and it was clear that the system needed to be reassessed. The investigation into the young officer's actions was underway, but the director felt a growing sense of urgency. He knew that it wasn't enough for the officer to face consequences for what had happened. That alone wouldn't solve the bigger problem. The problem wasn't just with one officer. It was with the way law enforcement responded in high-pressure situations, how officers were trained, and how they were expected to handle fear and uncertainty. The director had spent much of his career navigating complex issues, but this felt different. It wasn't about solving a case or bringing criminals to justice. It was about rebuilding something more fundamental, the relationship between law enforcement and the people they were sworn to protect. That was the real challenge, and it wasn't going to be solved with a few changes to policy. It was going to take a long, difficult conversation, one that would require honesty, reflection, and a commitment to change. As the investigation progressed, the director found himself meeting with other law enforcement leaders, discussing how to address the issue at hand. They knew that the incident involving the young officer was just one example of a larger problem. The truth was, these types of situations had been happening more often, even if they didn't always make the headlines. Officers, particularly those who were new to the job, often found themselves in stressful situations where they didn't know how to react. Fear, lack of experience, and poor judgment could quickly escalate into something dangerous. And when that happened, it didn't just hurt the officer, it hurt the entire system. At one of the meetings, the director sat across from several senior officers, all of them reflecting on the same question: how could they prevent situations like this from happening again? The room was filled with frustration but also determination. It was clear that something needed to change. "We can't keep sweeping these things under the rug," one of the senior officers said. "The public needs to know we're doing something to address these issues. They need to feel safe, and that means we need to rebuild their trust." The director nodded in agreement. He had heard this message countless times before, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just about public perception anymore. It was about ensuring that law enforcement officers had the tools, training, and support they needed to make better decisions in the field. "This isn't just about punishing one officer," the director said, his voice firm. "It's about a systemic change. We need to make sure that every officer, regardless of rank or experience, knows how to handle high-pressure situations, how to de-escalate a situation before it gets out of hand." The room fell silent as everyone took in his words. They knew he was right. The young officer's actions had highlighted a much deeper issue, an issue that had been ignored for too long. But now they had an opportunity to fix it. It wasn't going to be easy, but they couldn't afford to wait any longer. The director spent the next several weeks working with experts in law enforcement training, consulting with psychologists and revisiting the department's protocols. The goal was clear. They needed to create a more comprehensive training system, one that focused not just on physical tactics, but on the mental and emotional aspects of policing. Officers needed to learn how to manage fear, anxiety, and stress in the field, how to think clearly when their instincts might be telling them to act quickly. It wasn't about removing the human element from policing. It was about making sure that human reactions didn't lead to deadly mistakes. As the investigation into the young officer continued, the director felt a growing sense of hope. It wasn't just about making sure the officer faced the consequences of his actions. It was about creating a system where mistakes like that didn't happen in the first place. And that meant addressing the root causes of the problem, not just the symptoms. The young officer's future was still uncertain, but it was clear that he was going to face significant consequences for his actions. He had made a grave mistake, one that had shaken the foundation of the law enforcement community. But even as the director watched the investigation unfold, he couldn't help but feel a sense of empathy for the officer. He had made a mistake, yes, but he was still a young man, still learning the ropes of a job that demanded a level of composure and decision-making that most people could never understand. The director knew what it was like to make a mistake, to be faced with the consequences of a poor decision. He knew that the officer had a long road ahead of him, one filled with challenges and hard lessons. The investigation eventually concluded, and the young officer was placed on administrative leave. His career, at least for the time being, was on hold. The director couldn't say what the future held for him, but he knew that the officer would need time to reflect on his actions, to learn from his mistake, and to rebuild his career. It wasn't going to be easy, but the director hoped that the officer would come out of this experience stronger, more capable and more aware of the weight of his responsibilities. As for the director, the aftermath of the incident had left him with a renewed sense of purpose. The incident had opened his eyes to the flaws in the system, to the areas where change was needed. And while he knew that it wouldn't be easy, he was determined to make things right. He had spent his career dealing with the aftermath of mistakes, but this was different. This time, he was going to work to prevent the mistakes from happening in the first place. In the months that followed, the director and his team implemented new training programs for officers, focusing on mental health, emotional regulation, and conflict resolution. The public was made aware of the changes, and the law enforcement community began to slowly regain some of the trust that had been lost. The director knew that it was going to take time, but he was willing to put in the work. The system needed to change, and he was going to be at the forefront of that change. For the young officer, the future was uncertain. But one thing was clear: he had learned a hard lesson. The director hoped that he would use his experience to grow, to become a better officer, and to contribute to the changes that were needed in the system. Mistakes were part of life, but the real measure of a person was how they learned from those mistakes and how they moved forward. As for the director, he knew that this was just one chapter in a much larger story. The work was far from over, but he was ready to continue, to push for the change that was needed and to ensure that future generations of officers would be better prepared, better trained, and more equipped to handle the challenges they faced. In the end, it wasn't just about fixing a broken system. It was about creating a better, safer future for everyone.